Welcome, UHS, to today's lesson for World Studies. This is Mr. Harris from the World Studies team, and today we were talking about developing countries and developed countries. Now, some of you may already be familiar with those terms. If you are not, here's some hints that may help you out start to figure out what exactly it is we're talking about. If we look around the world, where are developed and where are developing countries? The developed world is the United States, Canada, most of Europe, as well as Russia, Japan, South Korea, Oceania, and that's about it. If we look at where the developing world is, it's Latin America, Africa, most of the Middle East, and Asia. On the right side, you see an image from a developing countries. This should give you further clues to what we're talking about today. This is from a slum or a shanty town that often arise at the edges of cities in developing countries. When we are giving our definition for a developing country, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but we're often focusing very heavily on the economic development, okay? Money. And we consider things like what kind of work is being done inside of the country? Are most people farmers? Are most people in low-wage manufacturing? Or are they working in offices, doing high-end design and other skilled career positions? In developing countries, we also care a lot about the low standard of living that many people suffer from. There are rich people, of course, in developing countries, but we're looking at averages today. In these developing countries, they usually have low incomes and yet high populations. So when you're trying to think of what's your definition, think of little industry, a low standard of living, and low income, but high population. For our developed countries, which the United States is one, these are countries with more industry and more advanced technology. Most of the population lives in towns or cities and works in offices or factories. And we'll look at some numbers behind this as well here in a minute. This image you're looking at is the Earth at night from space. So it was created using satellites, and it shows us where electricity and light is being emitted at night, which is one sign of population and development. In the eastern side of the United States, we see it's almost entirely white. That's where most of our population is living. There's Chicago right there. We're a little bit beneath that. Not as many people in the Rocky Mountains or up around Alaska. Europe, obviously, lots of development, lots of wealth, lots of people. We see a lot in East Asia as well, but not as much in the developing world, especially in areas like sub-Saharan Africa or over in Indonesia, which has lots of people living in it, but not as much electricity being used. This actually shows a developed country, South Korea, next to a developing country, North Korea. And the border here is kind of where development and electricity seem to end. Pyongyang is their capital city, so they have more stuff there, but in the rural or countryside regions, not very much going on. They cannot provide enough electricity for their entire country at night. This is a little bit of a stereotypical image, but it can be helpful. In developed countries, we do usually have more services offered for people, especially in the cities, whether that be commercial or public services like trash. In developing countries, not as much. I actually used to live in Cairo, Egypt, and despite it being a giant city, I saw many farm animals inside the city limits, and the trash people were people who came and collected it, dig through and resold things from the garbage, not a service provided by anybody else, and there was often garbage left out on the street. Now, there's lots of ways to determine development. We're going to look at 5 key ways today, and these are the same things used by the United Nations. The first one, which we'll talk a lot about, is gross domestic product. We are also going to look at life expectancy, how long someone lives for. We will next look at literacy rate, can you read and write? We'll also look at how much time people spend in education and the healthcare system in different countries. Gross domestic product is a very important number, a very important definition we're going to use a lot this year. Now, GDP is the total dollar value of all goods and services produced within a country during one calendar year. Think about if we took everybody in the United States and counted up how much they earned in income on that year, put it all together, that gives you your GDP. So this is looking at how much wealth each country is producing. And if we look at total GDP, that is the whole country together, the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, producing somewhere around $20 trillion. There's different estimates for this. Next to us is China, which is producing around $14 trillion a year, and they're actually growing at a much quicker rate than we are in the United States. So it's likely within the next 5, 10, 15 years, they could surpass us in total GDP. When people say the United States is the wealthiest country in the world, this is what they were referring to. After China is Japan, Germany, India, which also has a very high growth rate and will probably be number 3 in our lifetimes, UK, France, Italy, Brazil, Canada, Russia, South Korea, Spain, Australia, Mexico, and Indonesia. Another way of thinking about this graphically is if we took all the wealth produced in the world and split it up, the United States made somewhere right around 25% of the world's wealth last year. China, 15%. These countries in blue are all of our Asian countries. These countries in green are our European countries, and you see how big the green slice and the blue slice and the red slice. Much smaller slices are our friends in Latin America, then Oceania. Africa, unfortunately, has a very small slice on here, and the Middle East is over there. During our class this year, we're going to talk a lot about kind of why the world looks like this today and the injustices that have happened in the past. So we divide our countries up based upon these different levels of wealth. And now total wealth is not helpful for this. So we care more about the average wealth of a person in a country. So we use this really important statistic called per capita GDP, per person gross domestic product. And how we determine it is we take the country's whole wealth and divide it by the number of citizens. In the year 2020, China's gross domestic product was somewhere around $14 trillion. China also has the world's biggest population, about 1.4 billion people. So you divide those numbers and you end up with around $10,000 per person per year is how much wealth China is creating. And we use this per capita GDP to split the world into developing and developed countries. As you can see, the US is the darkest color on here, which represents that we make more than $50,000 per person per year on average. So is some of our Western European countries, that is Germany, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, those oil-rich countries over here. And then Australia, and that's about it. We, of course, our countries in this dark purple are still doing really well for themselves. And then Latin America is kind of in this middle income group, most of them. And then we go down a bit further, and these countries that are now getting into this blue shade, these are going to be what we really consider our low-income developing countries. As you can see, the world's not fair. And again, we'll explain a lot in our class this year kind of why this looks that way, but South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Latin America a little bit as well, are not doing as great financially as some of our other countries. Spoiler alert, these countries were all colonized in the past. Here are some numbers for per capita GDP around the world. Now, you might look at this US number, $63,000, and think, well, that's the average number? You know, my family's kind of below average, and so are a lot of people. Well, remember, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, those billionaires pull that average up. Our median income is about $34,000 per person per year. But these are still useful numbers comparing around the world. As you can see, Switzerland is doing really well. Qatar also. Luxembourg, I think, is number 2 right now, with only Monaco which shouldn't count. It's a little tiny country, doing better, but obviously very, very wealthy. If we look at some of our neighbors nearby, Mexico is right at about $10,000 per person per year. Honduras, $2,500. Guatemala, $4,500. So this can help us understand why some people from these countries might want to come to a country like the United States where wages are higher and improve their lives for their family. In other parts of the world, we can see Egypt, $3,000 per person per year. The Philippines near that. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, only $561 per person per year. That's not a lot. Somalia, as far as we know, is doing even worse than that. North Korea doesn't tell us anything. They stay very secretive. We can also think about how far does that money actually go? If I gave you a choice of having $1,000 a month in America or $1,000 a month in Guatemala, I think I know what a lot of us might pick. That money is going to go farther in countries that are not as developed. So we call that the purchasing power parity, okay? PPP, which is a better judgment of how much money and spending power someone has. I also really like this Big Mac index, which tells us how many hours a person would have to work to buy a Big Mac in that country on average. And if we look at that, the champion, last time I checked, was Hong Kong, which the average person only has to work 9 minutes to buy a Big Mac. America is in this next grouping here, where it's about 11 minutes. And then we have our developing countries, Mexico, 78, Philippines, 88, Kenya, over 3 hours, okay, that the average person would have to work to afford a Big Mac in Kenya. We also care about life expectancy. This is the average age a person usually lives. Many factors are included in life expectancy, including diet, exercise, pollution, drug usage, with tobacco and alcohol really pulling these rates down in certain countries. Violence and disease all factor into this. Most of the difference comes, though, however, from how many children pass away in the first year of life. This really sad statistic is called the infant mortality rate. Poor countries often lack the medical services needed to help their citizens. This is a map showing us life expectancy around the world. As you can see, these countries that are in dark green, Canada, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, are doing over 80 years per person they're expected to live for. We're in the next group down between 75 and 80, as is a lot of the world in that 70 to 75 range. And the leader right now currently is Taiwan, which I think they're right at 85 years on average they're living for. Then we look at South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. A really important factor to remember is infant mortality rate, but also malaria. Malaria, that disease spread by mosquitoes, kills about 1 million to 2 million people a year, almost entirely in developing countries. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we also have the problem of HIV/AIDS, which is pulling down our life expectancy. This infant mortality rate, if you look at only the wealthy countries of the world, only the developed countries, America is actually doing pretty badly, okay? Finland and Japan, which have similar levels of wealth as us, have almost a third as many infants die as we do in our country, and there are definitely a lot of holes in our healthcare system, especially for our poorer citizens. All the rest of these countries provide free healthcare for their citizens, paid for by their taxes. Globally, unfortunately, in the developing countries, they are the ones who are not doing as well. Historically, though, all countries of the world are doing a much, much better job than in the past, when infant mortality rate would be very, very high. So even though it's not where we want it to be, the human species have made tremendous improvements, especially in the last 30 years. Our next measure to determine developed and developing is the literacy rate, which is how many people can read and write at an adequate level for communication. Most of the world is above 75%. Then we have some places there is big gaps in education between the wealthy and the poor, but also between men and women. In societies that they don't provide free education and the families must pay for it, oftentimes the families choose to pool their resources to invest into their male children because they think they can earn more money for them in the future. It's really sad, and it does lead to a gender disparity in the literacy rate, especially in the Sahel, which are these countries that are partially in the Sahara Desert in North Africa. I want to remind you guys that even inside of a country, there can be tremendous differences between each state and each city. This is India, and we're looking at the literacy rate in different cities. In these dark red areas, it's less than 73%, which is the average for the whole country. But then we see areas like these green ones where it's more than 86%, and even this province in eastern India where it's at 95%. Think about the education system in Illinois or Massachusetts, which actually leads the country, versus that of, I don't know, Mississippi. Concerning education, there's lots of numbers we can look at to decide where countries are ranked and whether they should be listed as developed or developing. We're going to look at average years of schooling for adults. In our country, K through 12 education is compulsory. That means you have to go. And then many of our citizens also attend college. So we actually average over 12 years of education, as do some of our Western European countries, Australia, Japan. And currently, the country that has the most educated population is actually South Korea. Then we see countries who are not doing as much as far as education being in school, with some people getting less than 4 years of education on average. Of course, less educated people can't move into the better jobs and make more money for their country. We also, of course, care about the healthcare system, which is very relevant considering our current global pandemic and our response to it. If we look at ranking the world's healthcare systems, it makes sense the developed world would have better healthcare as they have more money to spend on this, and they also have more institutions that train doctors. Western Europe typically is considered to have the best healthcare systems, with France and this chart being number one. The United States doesn't do that well for a country that's this rich. We do have some of the best doctors and specialists in the world, but not everybody has access to the highest quality healthcare. Latin America not doing quite as great. Neither is some parts of Asia, and then unfortunately in sub-Saharan Africa and Afghanistan, they're not doing as great either. We should also consider brain drain. A lot of people who train to become doctors in the developing world move to places like the United States where they can earn more income from their family, but they take all that genius and hard work out of their country and we take it. A couple other statistics that go along with our healthcare system. We want to care about the death rate, the number of deaths per year per 1,000 people. Okay. In the United States, I thought this was interesting to you guys. This is looking at what are the biggest causes of death. Of course, the current situation is not in play in this chart. And in America, it's heart disease, then cancer, then accidents. After that, respiratory disease, stroke, diabetes, on down the list. And unfortunately, suicide is relatively high in the United States. What many would consider to be a happier statistic is the birth rate. And this is how many children are born per woman on average. If you look at the United States birth rate, going back 60 years, it was very high, 3.6 children per woman. Then we see this tremendous drop off here, thanks birth control. And since then, we've had little increases and decreases. And right now, our birth rate is only 1.6 kids per woman on average, which is below the level of replacement to keep the population the same. Around the world, the developed country tends to have lower birth rates. One of the reasons for this is that women and men continue their education through college and often put off marriage and having children till later on. So the ones that are the lowest are actually Western Europe and Japan and South Korea. The populations of Japan and lots of Western European countries is actually shrinking. In the United States and Canada and a lot of the rest of the developed world, it's very low, but we also get the benefit of immigration, so our population is still increasing. In our developing world, it's of course higher, with more children being born, especially to farmers who think it's a good idea to have a lot of children so they can have help in the farm work. The birth rate is very closely connected to the population growth rate, which is the amount the population is growing every year. Developing countries usually are growing quicker than developed countries. Right now, the population growth rate is about 1% for the entire world. And that may not sound like a lot, but that's about 75 million more people per year. And our population growth rate has gone from about 2 or so and just declined to we're right here around 1% per year, and they think it's going to drop off further in the future. Most experts think the world's population will cut off around 10 billion people. This shows the developed and developing world and how they're growing at different rates. The developed world, down here in pink, has never been that high in the last 70 years. And now it's getting lower and lower, and they think it will actually, on average, shrink by the year 2050. Our developed world, okay, much higher here, but it too is dropping off a lot. So though still growing quicker, but overall our population growth rate is lessening around the world. Now, your life statistically, on average, is better than 3/4 of the world's population. Now, I can't speak to your life as an individual because obviously in our country we have great deals of inequality and other injustices, but people in developing countries are starting off from a much lower place on average, income-wise, schooling-wise, disease-wise. I used to live in a couple of developing countries, and life for the average people there was much different from our own. I'm not dismissing any of our problems here in the States, but let's also factor in what it's like for other people around the world. A few more things I want to add today. In the developing world, many people still continue to live as subsistence farmers. That means they grow food to eat, not to sell at the marketplace. And in many of our really poor countries, this is how most of the population continues to live, with maybe selling a small amount of their food. In the United States and in other developed countries, we have commercial farming. There's lots of farmland in our community. However, those farmers aren't going out in the field and eating the corn and the soybeans. They're collecting it and selling it at the market. Also in our country, only about 1% of the population is farmers, but thanks to the superior technology, that 1% can actually make enough food to feed 2 Americans. In many of our developing country, many people still live in the rural areas. We have these in developed regions as well, but this is usually when more than half the population still lives in farming communities. While we, of course, most people live in urban areas, and yes, Urbana counts as an urban area. And usually, large populations, more industry. There's lots of places around the world where developed is right next to developing, and this is usually where we see a lot of immigration. Now, I'm going to take a snapshot of 2 countries, one developing and one developed, and just show you guys some other comparisons. So, Ethiopia, which is one of the most interesting countries in the world to me, has around 110 million people living there. Of that big population, 46% are under the ages of 15. Maybe that sounds cool to you guys, but that sounds like a nightmare to me. And their population is so young because people die on average earlier there, and people are having lots and lots of kids. Only about 17% of the people live in the cities, the rest are still living in rural areas, and the life expectancy there is only about 56 years. There's only 0.02 doctors per 1,000 people. That means there's roughly one doctor for every 40,000 people inside of the country, so you can imagine healthcare is hard to come across. Also, only 50% of men and 35% of women can read and write. We see that giant gender disparity here because of the cost of schooling for people. Now, their per capita GDP is $857. If you average that out to how much money that means in Ethiopia, that's around $2,000 per person per year, which is about $6 a day. Imagine if you had to live on $6 a day. Let's compare that with a developed country, the United Kingdom, that also went around and colonized most of the world. They currently have around 63 million people. Only 17% are under the age of 15 because their birth rate is much lower. 80% of their population lives in cities. They have about an 80-year life expectancy, and they have about one doctor for every 350-ish people or so. Much better. And 99% of the men and women there can read and write, and their GDP per capita is at $43,000. All right, guys, I hope this was a helpful lesson for understanding this. We'll talk more about this in our world studies classes.